Salty noodle.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. My name's Taylor. I thought I'd talk to you guys about D&D tropes, or my favorite tropes that I like to use against my party. I think a lot of players and people misunderstand tropes. They assume they're cliches, or they've been used too many times, and they're boring and predictable. But the best thing about tropes is using them against the party just to give them the old switcheroo, see if they're paying attention, rather than maybe being on their phones or just drifting off into a nice beer coma. I'd like to talk to you guys about some of my favorite tropes and the ones that I felt like worked, and some I'd recommend for you guys to use as well. I'll start off with my first trope. One of my favorites, I would probably call this one the mystery man or the hooded figure. I got this idea off of Reddit somewhere. I'll have to see if I can track it down and put a link to it down below. This trope is really good for players who feel like they already just want to get the adventure going and they just want to punch a bunch of stuff and they don't care about story. Maybe they just want to min-max their character. So I feel like this is a really good way to start the adventure, and it's super easy to use because it starts off in the tavern or in the bar or a public setting, wherever you're starting, just in public around people. How it works is you have a hooded figure sitting at the bar. The players cannot see into the hood. They can't really peer around into the hood. It's just utter darkness. You can justify this by saying maybe there's like a minor illusion on it, but if the party checks for magic or anything like that, they're not really going to see anything. This isn't anything that's going to damage them, so feel free to fudge magic however you want. Just for this is a good laugh. This is how I look at the trope, is it's good for playing a prank on your party. Essentially how it works is the player goes up to the target, the hooded figure sitting at the bar, and says, "Hey, who are you?" or "What's your deal?" or "Why are you here?" or "Who do you know?" Those kind of questions. But they get no response from the hooded figure. The hooded figure is actually a broomstick in disguise with just a cowl or a cape or a hood over it. Maybe a really long hood, upper body piece, whatever you want to call it. It's set up by the barkeep. They'll give the hooded figure a shove or they'll give it a push, and you got to make them give it a good push for the broom to fall over. Once they do that and the broomstick falls over, it's revealed to the player or the party that it was actually just a broomstick all along, and there's a nice tally marks up on the wall, maybe in some chalk, and the barkeep walks over and adds another little notch to the chalk. I think it's super fun. It's really funny. It's a good way to get a laugh out of your players. If you're playing music, I usually stop the music just to make it more suspenseful when they go to push the hooded figure over. That's one of my favorites to begin an adventure with, especially if you're playing with people who you haven't used that against. Next one I use sparingly, but I used it several times with people who had never played D&D before. I feel like for players who have played video games or understand that the world has magical items in it, or they're like, I want a really cool sword. When do I get a cool sword? When do I get some cool drums that play only Despacito? You know, when do I get a bow that shoots flaming arrows? Basically how this trope works is you have a magical little gnome show up, or an old wizard man who poofs in out of nowhere. He has a bag of holding and allows each player to reach into the bag of holding, and they have to roll 0 through 100. I'll try to find the list, but I have a list somewhere that I saved that someone made on Reddit where it's level 1 or very early level common and uncommon magic items that do random effects. Some of them are super useful, most of them are not. That's the best part about reaching into this magical gnome's bag of holding, is they're probably going to get a little trinket that makes more noise than it's worth. In one of my adventures, I had one party member reach in and pull out some coconuts, which I think I made up on the spot, actually. I merged two items together, but I basically made them the coconuts from Monty Python, and they just made horse clopping sounds that they could smack together and run along. And I talked about that in my first video, where I think I mentioned it. I had another party member reach in. He rolled a really good number. I don't remember what the number was, but it was basically like a tiny beholder. I believe the tiny beholder allowed you to see ahead in the room, but another person in our party had a familiar who was a warlock, and his class basically already did that, so I modified the Beholder to be a stun grenade. If they threw it properly, it would stun an enemy in a very small 5-foot cube, which they really loved. I know it sounds kind of OP, but when you're running a one-shot for people, you just kind of want them to have fun. So I merged items or I fudged a lot of things just so the players were having a lot of fun. One of my favorite things to set up for a party is a cliche dungeon. And you start off this cliche dungeon with a awesome trap that's coming up ahead. You make it look like so many people have died from this trap. There's skeletons and arrows in them, bodies lying everywhere on the ground, maybe some pools of blood just for fun. You put a trap up ahead of them that they can't prevent from setting off. Someone might get mad at you and say, hey, I checked for traps, why didn't this pop up? And you just have to say, this trap was a really high roll and there's almost no way you can detect it. It's very high level magic. Again, this is a trap that is just to mess with them and it doesn't really harm them. I call this trap the bad guy didn't quite think ahead trap. You make this super elaborate forming trap that does nothing. It's wonderful. You have a player trip a wire, step on a tile, or trigger some alarm that causes a pedestal to come out of the ground. It comes out of the ground very slowly and very dramatic, and you might want to build it up a little bit more than that and say, this multi-tiered pedestal radial dais comes up out of the ground. It looks like it has some druidic markings on it, and you've never seen anything like this before. It looks evil. At the last second, you have a little sign just jut out of the top of the dial, or the podium, or what have you, and it says, reminder, put trap here later. It's the old Joker gun where he fires his gun and the word bang pops out instead of actually shooting anything, which I think is hilarious. That one got a good laugh too. Another one I like to do is make the party choose one of 3 doors. And you can put whatever you want behind the doors. You can put puzzles behind the doors. You can put small traps behind the doors. But just making the party feel like they have a choice is a lot of fun. And whatever door they all pick, maybe they can only go through one door and they have to pick. You don't even have to have many options. They could all be the same option behind the door, but they won't know that. So there you go. Last but not least, I'd like to talk about the graveyard trope and the Lornado trope. The graveyard trope you often see in film and video games. It's essentially giving the party the illusion of safety or an area that they've already traveled through or are about to travel through that appears dangerous but ends up being safe for them. However, 5 minutes later, they have to go back through that area and suddenly it's dangerous. I feel like that is used a lot in horror films where they establish a safety for the audience and then, surprise, gotcha, here's the scary part. You thought it was safe, it's not safe anymore. Yeah, gets real old in film. Works real well in D&D though. I had a party go through a graveyard into a mausoleum. They had to solve a puzzle in the mausoleum. And once they did that, it flipped on the lights outside and lit up a cathedral, which then awakened zombies in the graveyard. So when they came back through outside, they had to fight a horde of zombies. I also used it on a old cobblestone bridge, and the bridge looked very old and was kind of falling apart, and the party made it across fine, but then they realized they had to go back across the bridge because they had hit a dead end. And I think they realized they were in trouble, so some people jumped across, nearly flew across. Someone was thrown across, but they all managed to get across except for one person who tripped and their head fell in the water, which then gave them amnesia. I had the water be cursed, so if anybody touched it, they basically get amnesia for various lengths, and when someone had their head dip in, I gave them amnesia for a half hour. In real life time. The last one I'd like to talk about is the Lornado. A Lornado sounds scary, but isn't. It's basically a bunch of papers that whirl up into a whirlwind, forming a tornado, and kind of slap the party around. How it works is your party will be adventuring through a old monastery, or a library, or a temple, looking for an artifact, a book, or an ancient scroll. There will be a bunch of papers thrown about on the ground, and once the venturing party finds their item, that triggers the tornado. So how it works is once the players touch the item they are looking for, it triggers up the papers, and they start flying and spinning, forming a giant tornado that probably would apply force damage. I had the tornado just force push the party back the opposite direction they were facing, and if they slammed into an object, they took like 1 to 4 force damage. I just had them roll die. Especially if they're level 1 or even up to level 3, I would just keep the damage low, but it's a good way to keep the party on their feet, and I think it's a funny little trap that you can set. Last but not least, you gotta use a secret passageway. I often use a bookshelf. I know, cliche, but how I make it work is I put a bunch of books up there, and the party can just start pulling books if they want, frantically off the shelf, with which a lot of people do. Sometimes people investigate, but I like to put at least like 6 options up on the shelf. I think one of the books was named A History of Minotaurs, Part 4, and that dropped like a belt of strength. I had another book drop some potions. It was like Love Potion number 9 was the name of the book or something, and it dropped a health potion. Then I had some old cliche name for what actually allowed the bookcase to swing out. I can't remember what I used, if it was Secrets Between You and Me, the title, or something like that. Some dumb name that I came up with, or some pun on an already popular existing book. But yeah, those are the tropes that I found worked. Feel free to comment down below or ask questions if you want me to talk about more tropes or traps that I used. And go ahead and smash that subscribe button. No, but please, feel free to follow along as I make more of these videos. If anybody wanted that kind of thing.